We are going today to Wilmington, and this is, I still think of it as the Wilmington Arms, but it is now called the Giant's Rest, which is a lovely name for it. And I've always liked this pub. I haven't been here for many years. One of the things I liked about it in the old days is it didn't have a canopy over the bar, and that was unusual then, and it kind of made the bar look larger and more interesting. Now lots of them don't have those big sort of 1960s canopies anymore, but this is quite a nice place, and we're going to have a drinky. And what did I find when we got there? That's right, they put a bloody bar canopy in, but it's a neoclassical or neo-Georgian style bar canopy in plain timber, and if you must have a bar canopy, then it's quite a nice one. So I'm not all that upset about it. Now, while I was there, I also discovered that there is now such a thing as Seaford gin. So this is another Sussex thing now, Seaford gin. And we're going up to see the Long Man. Now, back in the early 90s, there was a bit of controversy because people said that his feet had moved back to the original position, and there was a witch who said that this was an omen, that the English nation would abandon Christianity and return to our own native religion, the religion of our ancestors. At one time it was said that the Long Man had a companion, a female like himself, and some people said they were Adam and Eve. There was even a story amongst locals in more church-going days that he was antediluvian, that he had been put there before the Great Flood. Now, some people say that the Long Man is a bit like one of those police outlines, and there was an actual giant who was killed there. Some say he got in a fight with another giant, and the other giant threw a stone at his head like a big boulder, which is a common story in many parts of Europe. And others say that the other giant lent him a hammer, threw him the hammer, and unfortunately it hit his friend on the head, killing him. Now, this yew tree was not planted in this churchyard. On the contrary, this churchyard was built around this yew tree. This yew tree is not only older than this churchyard, it's older than England. It may even be older than Sussex, at least by a few decades, because it was first planted in around the year 400. And as every schoolboy knows, Britain was expelled from the Roman Empire in 410. So no wonder it needs crutches. So if the tree has been alive since this was a Roman province, just how old is the Long Man? And of course part of that is what does he represent as well. Some people claim the Long Man's as recent as the 17th century, others claim that he's Neolithic. Various explanations of who he might also be is a Roman soldier, a Saxon god or warrior, or a medieval saint. There's even been a jocular suggestion that he might actually be a surveyor with a ranging pole in each hand. The trouble is that chalk figures started very early in prehistory and are still being made today, so it's difficult to tell. But the barrow at the top is Neolithic, so definitely this area was used in that period. But then again, we're right by a priory, so perhaps he was an icon built by medieval monks. Sheep, of course, and you're never very far from sheep in Sussex, and I think that's how it should really be. Milton Street ahead, and the comforts of the Sussex Ox. And before we get to the Ox, I thought it would be interesting, because we've been talking about sheep, to talk about the dark side of sheep, because it was the sheep, of course, that were inadvertently the cause of the smuggling. It was the export smuggling of wool, which was known as owling, that really made Sussex a smuggling centre. First things were sent out, evading the export duty, and then things started to be brought in, avoiding the import duty. Now, we used to have people called batmen, and batmen on roads like this, where you had smuggling caravans, were the guards, called batmen because they carried wooden bats. But as the money poured in, they tended to arm themselves up with more than wooden bats, swords, guns, and some of these batmen were big, scary men. The caravans were like little armies on the move. And once you got your cargo a certain distance from the coast, they couldn't actually hang you for it any longer. So that very dangerous part of the journey, once you got far enough inland, that's when smugglers would tend to fight for it, rather than... Because what's the point? You can hardly say it's a fair cop governor when it's a capital offence, which it was in those days. And here we are at the Ox. And yes, indeed, they are open, despite it being a Tuesday afternoon. And I'm looking forwards, because I haven't been in here for a very long time. That's good. Sussex Ox, which I haven't been in for about 30 years. I was last been here with my late father. But my sister, she used to come in here with her boyfriend a lot in the 1970s, and they used to know this biker. I never met him, I was just a school kid at the time. But apparently he looked exactly like King Charles I. He had an uncanny resemblance to him. He had the long hair, he had the little Van Dyke beard, except that he was kind of wearing 1970s motorbiking leathers. And I suppose he might have been a relation, you never know, because Charles I had a son, Charles II, and well, as was once said, father of his people, well, I a great many of them. So you don't know, he had a lot of kids, a lot of them unacknowledged, and centuries later, perhaps that biker was a Stuart without knowing it. Now, oxen have a particular relationship with Sussex because we kept ploughing with oxen here much later than most other parts of the country. See, the trouble is the gradient. It's not suitable for horses, so they had to use oxen until tractor engines came in. Tractor engines with drum ploughs, you could plough some of these difficult gradients. But until then, they were still reliant on oxen. So we tend to think of ploughing oxen as medieval, but in Sussex, they survived until quite late. So here we are, leaving the Sussex Ox and heading for Alfriston. This part of Sussex is very much known for fairies, and we're going to near a place called Burlow Castle, which is much associated with fairies. Now, there's a bit of a misconception about fairies. There's this story, if someone says, oh, I don't believe in fairies, a fairy dies. Well, that might be true in Disneyland, but not in Sussex. In Sussex, if you say, I don't believe in fairies, then you die, not the fairies. And you die usually of some horrible wasting disease within a year. So I don't say that. I very much do believe in fairies. Well, we've already discussed fairies and giants, or elites might be a more correct term in this part of the world. But another Sussex legend that is associated with Alfriston, and I'm surprised really because I generally associate it with rather damper places like the marshes, is the wish hound. Now the wish hound is supposed to be a large, an abnormally large black dog, very fierce looking. But it's not to be worried about because it's fierce, but because it's a harbinger of death. They say that if you see the wish hound, it means that you haven't got long to live. You'll die fairly soon. And I wonder really if seeing the wish hound means you're going to die, or you're going to see the wish hound because you're going to die. Which is the cause? That's the question. This is Alfriston Church. This is one of many churches which is sometimes referred to as the Cathedral of the Downs. There are about 4 or 5 that are called the Cathedral of the Downs. But there's an interesting story about how it got to be here. Because supposedly when it was being built, teams of men kept finding the stones moved. They were being moved. And it's like, is this God that's doing this, or is this the devil? So they then saw on this site where the stones had been moved to 4 white oxen. And the 4 white oxen were standing in the form of a cross. Indeed, this is a cruciform church. It's rather like the 4 oxen standing back to back, which is very interesting. This story is found in other parts of England about the 4 white oxen. It's also interesting because, of course, the church is very Christian, but white oxen have a very strong pagan significance. If you read, I think it's Tacitus, where he's talking about the ancient Germans, and he's in fact talking about tribes from southern Denmark, which the English are supposed to come from. He does talk about white oxen, and white oxen pulling the image of a mother goddess. So there's a strong connection between us and white oxen in this country, and it's a spiritual thing, and it's been Christianized, but it probably has a pre-Christian origin. Now this is the Star Inn. Now, Star Inn's always fascinated me, and originally it was built as a friary, but within about 20 years of it being built, of course, the dissolution of the monasteries happened, and it got sold off, and I think it's been a pub ever since. It's particularly famous for this ship's figurehead. Now, everybody's agreed that this figurehead of a lion, yes, it's supposed to be a lion. I'm not sure how much David Attenborough would be convinced of it, but it is a lion. It's pretty much agreed that it was salvaged off a Dutch ship. But it's not sure when it was salvaged off a Dutch ship. Some people will tell you that it's 17th century, and some people will tell you that it's only 19th century. But it's a real icon. I've been fascinated by it since I was a kid. As long as I've known it, it's always been painted red, although sometimes it's been different shades of red. But I'd say it's one of the best recognised things in the county. So if you want to find the Star Inn, look for the red lion outside. I wonder if the red lion has a star outside. Called the Star, and indeed it has a lamp in the window shaped like a star, which I rather like. I think that's a very good idea. When are we ever going to get away from the village people? The village people or ABBA? We enter the place, the village people starts playing. This is Hophead from Dark Star Brewery, and I'm very fond of Hophead because it's not strong in terms of alcohol, but it's strong in terms of the amount of hopping in it. So, from the long man to young man, always time for a bit of a groove with us here at Tea with Julia. Remember that this was the pub that Spike Milligan and some other young soldiers during World War II got very drunk in and actually wrecked the place. They weren't fighting, they were just being rowdy and having a bit of fun. But somehow I seem to remember one of the ceilings collapsed. So this place was damaged structurally by Spike Milligan, future writer of the Goon Show. Now, one of the myths about Alfriston is that, and I believed it as a kid in the 70s, it's Alfred's town because he built his navy here. Well, he may or may not have built his navy here, but it's since been proven that the name is not derived from Alfred, as in Alfred Great, King of Wessex. Apparently the name is actually older than that. They proved it since. And the roads passing through it are Roman roads, so it was already a settlement before Alfred's day. Now, one of the myths about the Star Inn is there's supposed to have been a cauldron here in the 19th century, which was the one that Alfred burnt the cakes in. Now, all of that happened much further west in Wessex, opposite the island of Athenry. And also, what would you be doing making cakes in a cauldron? And I don't particularly remember sort of iron cooking vessels. I believe Vikings had iron cooking vessels, so maybe that's possible, but it doesn't sound very likely that the King of Wessex would be cooking cakes in a cauldron in Sussex. But the story has always interested me because burning cakes had religious significance for the Saxons. Before they became Christians, burning flour or burning cakes was a form of sacrifice, and you'll still find pre-Christian Saxon cemeteries, you'll still find layers of burnt flour, and in fact, I believe these practices are still outlawed in church law because they're part of English paganism. And in fact, so are gingerbread men. Gingerbread men are actually against church law. You're not supposed to make a figure of a man out of bread because our pre-Christian ancestors did that for religious purposes. And therefore, if you're Christian, you shouldn't really practice native English practices like making figures of people out of bread. Now, this is a very interesting Sussex thing. It's not a prop from the Lord of the Rings. This is an Abergavenny roof tile, or ridge tile, an Abergavenny ridge tile. Now, what has Abergavenny, a very Welsh place, and a presumably Welsh dragon, got to do with Sussex? Well, because at one time the Marquis of Abergavenny was a very big landowner in this area. And he used to mark his properties with these ridge tiles, sorry. And you will still see them around the county. In fact, the school where I went as a teenager actually had these Abergavenny roof tiles. Now, Alfriston was one of those places which benefited somewhat from the French Revolution because it kicked off over a quarter of a century of wars in Europe. I think something like 27 years we were at war. On and off. This was more than one war, it's a series of multiple wars. I always think of them as the war of the umpteen coalitions. But it did a lot of good for the local economy. A lot of troops here, not just British troops, but emigre troops from all over Europe opposing first the Directorate and then Napoleon Bonaparte. There was a tannery, there was a lot of business. But unfortunately, when all that ended, the economy took a little bit of a dent. And that will take us to another aspect of the place, which is that, like a lot of these very picturesque places, a bit like Rye, it's always these lovely tourist villages with very expensive houses that were dangerous and rough 200 years ago. In the late Georgian period, Alfriston was a very, very dangerous place. It was dominated by violent gangs. And one of these was led by a man called Stanton Collins. And I think it's a little bit like the Cray twins in London. You get this, they were lovely boys, they were great to their mum. The pensioners were all right in the East End when the boys were about. And they were a bit like this with Stanton Collins, who, quite frankly, seems to have been a very scary man, heading up a very scary gang, who were A, bringing cargoes in without going through, shall we say, proper customs forms, B, salvaging ships and not always doing it in a very legal manner, and taking produce and animals from local farms. But because this was these very, very difficult years after Waterloo, when the local economy had hit a bit of a downer, nobody seemed to mind too much. People don't mind criminals if they bring money into the community, and so Stanton Collins became a bit of a legend, and there's still a lot of talk about him round here. He's kind of entered folklore now. Now, over here behind me you can see the market cross, and the market cross is often described as 15th century, early 15th century, sort of Henry IV. But it's questionable how much of it is original. It's been altered a lot over the years. It's had rather fancy steps put on and then new fancy steps replacing it. And in fact, the actual shaft of the cross is only about a decade older than me. Because back in 1955, somebody actually drove a sodding great lorry straight into the market cross and snapped the actual spine of it. So how original the market cross in Alfriston is questionable. This is the old Smugglers Inn, formerly the Market Cross, and of course that isn't actually ye, it's the. What appears to be a Y represents the old thorn run of Old English, which we use to represent the TH sound. Now, the Smugglers is said to be haunted by a woman in a long gown. But interestingly, people who've seen her say it's definitely a recent gown, the last few decades. It's a modern evening dress, not something traditional. So she's probably a 1970s or 80s ghost. And Heather took this opportunity to demonstrate Toad in the Hole to some French tourists. Got it. Now, this object behind me is a bit of a conundrum. When I was a child in the 1970s, I often used to come past here with my parents, and they used to say, "Oh, that was a customs incinerator." If they'd seize cargoes, they'd burn it in here because there was no duty on it, it would be destroyed. And this was always treated as fact when I was growing up. Oh, that's an old customs incinerator. But in recent years, this has started to be questioned. And now nobody thinks that it is a customs incinerator. And they've got other theories about what it originally was. One is that it's a dovecot and the top is missing. Another is that it's a pottery kiln. But the most interesting theory is that it might be a shot tower. Now I'm going to get a bit technical here. when you make birdshot or buckshot, which is a bit bigger, it's for shooting larger animals, there are a number of ways you can make it. Now, the first way they used to make it was to beat lead into foil, cut the foil into strips, and then roll it up into pellets, a bit like when you're a kid and you make pellets for pea shooters, only with lead. And that was the early way of making shot for guns. For sport, well, you really used the same smooth bore for everything in those days. And then later on, they took to making birdshot or buckshot, using a gang mould. And that was still being done in the 18th century because it was convenient. But by the 18th century, they discovered that you'd make a better quality buckshot or birdshot by passing molten lead through a sieve at the top of a tower. And you pass your molten lead through a sieve, so supposedly you get roughly the droplet size you want, and gravity, as it goes down, it becomes more or less spherical, I know not completely spherical, and then it cools, and it hits the ground cooled, and you take your lead shot out the bottom, and if you've got the sieve at the top right, it should make very good shot, better than a gang mould will make. And some people think that that is what this was for, but it does look rather like the old prints I've seen of shot towers, but whether it is a shot tower or what the hell it is, we don't know. I mean, when I was a kid, it was just treated as fact. Oh, it's an old customs incinerator from years ago, and the whole Alfriston smuggling thing, that must have been what it was. And it was never really questioned. It was treated as fact in the 1970s, but nowadays there's a lot of questions over what it actually was. When I was a teenager, if anyone had a car, we'd pile out to Alfriston because it was the only place you could get Gale's HSB. Now, this is the George, and it's supposed to have one of the oldest alcohol licences in the country. It's been a pub since the 14th century. Now, in those days, if a free commoner had enough money to afford a sword, they had to own one, but they were not normally allowed to carry a sword unless ordered to by a crown officer. However, they were allowed to carry their swords when travelling between towns. So if you came to an inn like this, you would have to hand your sword in to the landlord. And it's interesting to think that this pub is so old that there will have been customers that had to do that.
Do we have one in here?
Oh, yeah, I think so.
Drinks, aren't
I think, well...
We don't know about.
Now, this place we found is called Tavern on the Tyne, and as it turned out, some friends of ours had rather a good meal in there recently. It's a little bar and restaurant with a very large beer garden out the back overlooking the church, and the owner, Chris, has moved here from Brighton. So we were quite pleasantly surprised. We didn't even know this place was here. And Heather there consulting the map before our walk home. It was getting a little bit late. We didn't realise it because it was still nice and sunny, but this time of year the evenings can draw in rather fast. Now, this is the Litlington Horse. There was an original 19th century Litlington Horse, but it's now grown out. This current one was done in one full moon night in 1924 by 3 men. And the reason they did it in one night by the full moon is because they wanted a surprise for the locals the next day. Point out that we are going into the Cuckmere Inn. Right, we're going to run across the road before we get run over. And because of the time of year, it got dark rather earlier than we were anticipating that it would. And maps aren't that much good when you can't really see them. But I think we were on the wrong side of the river as well, which didn't help. So it's time for a drink, and I think I deserve this one. We're just finishing off here at the Cuckmere Inn, which I still think of as the Golden Galleon, because 70s, 80s was the Golden Galleon. I haven't been in here for about 6 or 7 years, and it's a bit sad because last time I was with Mum, and she's no longer in a state where we can go to places like this. But it's nice. Might be artificial cider, but it's cider and it's much needed after quite a long walk over from Alfriston, not from Marley, from Alfriston. And it was a nice walk, very pleasant. It got very dark towards the end, and I walked into quite a few thistles with bare legs, which wasn't that wonderful. But in general, it's been a very pleasant evening. So now we have a drinky, and then we're going to get a bus home.